with that, I just want to introduce a man who is one of the absolute, I would say, not just leading force, but titans in this movement. He has been around for decades trying to warn people about what is coming. And I think a lot of the worst things that he predicted have either been stopped or slowed down because of his tireless work. For decades he's been doing this. Let's hope he does it for decades more, and all of us are the better for his work, for his sacrifice, and for the unbelievable amount of time he has put in this. We all know his book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, about the Federal Reserve. That's right. I'm sure many of you have seen his videos on YouTube. Well, now, you few will get to say that you saw the man live. Everybody, Mr. G. Edward Griffin.
Well, thank you for that. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. Well, you are the die-hard group. You stuck through all of this. I'm surprised you're still here. Not burned out. Wait, like that. Yes, we have more bad news. That's what you needed, right? Well, actually, there is some good news here, and that is that I've never given this particular talk before, and so therefore it probably won't be as long as my usual ones. The truth is, normally I do a lot of preparation for talks, and I wind up with these ponderous dissertations. So the good news is I'm not going to bore you with a 2-hour, laboriously prepared presentation. I'm going to bore you with a 45-minute, recklessly prepared presentation. And as you know by now, my topic, assigned topic, which I was delighted to get, is Agenda 21. Now, to move right along on this topic, there are two versions of Agenda 21. There's what I would call the popular version, or perhaps the Wikipedia version. And then there's the Griffipedia version, which I will give you at the end of my presentation, which will be kind of a summary of what I'm talking about. But let's start with the Wikipedia version. It's the general image that most people have. If they know anything at all about Agenda 21, they have a pretty good feeling about it because of the way it's generally described. Now, and this is pretty much it. It goes like this. At the present rate in the world, life on Earth, as we know it, is doomed. It's doomed because of certain forces, huge, ponderous forces, which must be controlled. And those forces are the excessive human population. We've all heard that argument. We must do something about that. The next one is the exhaustion of natural resources. The next one is pollution of the environment. And the fourth really is sort of a subcategory of the previous section about pollution, and that's global warming. Global warming is indirectly related to all of this because we are told it is caused by CO2 production, which is related to industry. It's a byproduct of industry. And aside from the fact that CO2 is actually quite harmless, it's non-toxic to humans, and it's vitally essential to plants. In spite of that, it's still classified as a pollutant because of its assumed causal relationship to global warming. And we all know that global warming, we're told, is deadly, and if we don't do something about that, life will be extinguished on this planet. So there's basically the argument. Now, the rest of that argument is that because all of these threats are related in some way, or the direct result of human activity, therefore, it is obvious that the only solution to all of this is to control human activity. And therein lies the basic premise of Agenda 21. That is the argument, the justification for all of it. Now, therefore, this being the case, if you wanted to take this as sort of a resolution, everything I've just said is a whereas, a whereas, a whereas. Now we come to the therefore. Therefore, Agenda 21 is a plan created by the United Nations to establish what kinds of controls are needed and what kinds of mechanisms are needed to enforce those controls. And of course, the recurring phrase that's used throughout all Wikipedia discussions of this topic is that this is all done because we're trying to achieve sustainable development. And that is the key phrase you hear over and over and over again. So therein lies the basic description of what Agenda 21 is. And if you come into the topic without any preconceived ideas and you read the literature that's put out by proponents of this program, it doesn't sound very menacing. It sounds somewhat benign at worst. And to many people it sounds like it's absolutely wonderful that wise men and trustworthy committees are at work to solve this problem, because we certainly are concerned, are we not, about the future of life as we know it on this planet. We're concerned about the kind of a world that our children and our grandchildren are going to live in. So for many people, they're very grateful to know that there are people at the highest levels at the United Nations and elsewhere who are working to solve this problem. Now that's the Wikipedia description and understanding of my topic here tonight. Now, a little bit of nuts and bolts history on it before I get into the more interesting part. This won't take long, but we need to know this, nevertheless. Agenda 21 was launched in 1992 at what was called the UN Conference on Environment and Development. And that was held in Rio de Janeiro, as I said, in 1992. And that's, of course, Brazil. And people sometimes talk about the Brazil conference or the Rio de Janeiro conference, and that's what they're talking about, which is basically the launching pad for Agenda 21. Now, it has been continued and expanded and perfected at numerous global conferences by UN agencies ever since then. And each time these people get together, they build upon the accomplishments or the movement toward their ultimate goal that they've already achieved in the past. So this is not a static phenomenon. It is a growing and accelerating phenomenon. Now, the 21 in Agenda 21 stands for the 21st century, which is the timeline that these people have in mind for the complete implementation of Agenda 21. And at the rate they're going, I think they're going to achieve that goal much sooner than the end of the 21st century. Now, the implementation is intended to occur, according to the plan, to occur simultaneously at many levels of government throughout the world. They're working on it at the international level, of course, which is its birthplace. Most of the nations of the world are working on it at the national government level. In the United States and in other parts of the world, we have counterparts of states or regions or provinces at each level from the top down. For example, in the United States, we have committees and governmental agencies working at the state level, at the county level, and even at the city level. And I don't know whether it's a surprise to you, probably not to many of you in this room, but to those coming into the topic for the first time, it comes as a great surprise that this plan is already extensively implemented at the very local levels, at the city level and the county level in particular. In all of the counties and most of the cities, major cities for sure, in the United States, Agenda 21 is deeply embedded already. It's moved in there very quietly and very rapidly, I might add. The strategy is to build Agenda 21 from the ground up rather than from the top down. think it was a very wise strategy from those who are advocating it to get the local groups involved first, so that way it doesn't attract national attention, and you probably haven't heard too much about it in the national news. But Agenda 21 is far advanced in the United States. As any of you would know, if you have, as I have, attended some county meetings and listened to them talk about water projects, and building developments, and roads, and parks, and everything, and bicycle lanes, no matter what it is, you find the Agenda 21 strategy ingrained deeply in most of the proposals that are being discussed at the local governmental levels in the United States today. Now, furthermore, this plan calls for the harmonization of all of these levels of state and governmental involvement. So all of the rules and regulations are to be, as they call them, harmonized, so that the end product of this process will be the building of a tapestry, a global tapestry in which all of the nations, all of the local governments and communities of the world can be seamlessly merged into one master program. And so that is part of the plan, and this is what we are talking about. So having said that, now let's take a look at the plan itself, and I think the best place to begin is take a brief look, at least, at some of the assumptions that are built into this strategy. Some of the assumptions that are seldom challenged and most often just accepted as a fact of life. We don't question these assumptions, but we need to do them, and we'll start now. Now, I wish I had time to develop answers to all of these assumptions in length, because they are big topics, each one of them. But we're just going to touch on them and let you know at least the outline of what I think are some of the flaws in these assumptions. They surely deserve a great deal of additional thought and discussion and research on everyone's part, and we're actually working on that right now. But here they are in a very brief outline form. First, we'll talk about this limitation of resources and pollution, the danger of the exhaustion of our natural resources and pollution. Now, everyone knows that we have limited national resources, right? Everyone knows that we have pollution. And this is the wondrous part of all of this plan, is because you can start with something that everybody agrees with, you see. Anytime you've looked at a polluted stream, you think, we've got pollution. You can see pollution in the sky, pollution in the air, pollution in the water, debris all over the land, and you say, you're arguing that there's no pollution, nothing to worry about? No, I'm not arguing that at all. I'm the greatest anti-pollution guy you've ever seen. I'm the one that recognizes that there are limitations on natural resources, and they need to be protected. We're not talking about the what. We're talking about the how. This is the issue that is never discussed. In all of these areas where we have problems, the dialectic, as it was just described by Charlotte a moment ago, in all of these dialectical approaches to problems, you'll find that quite often, in fact almost always, there is some grain, sometimes big boulders of truth in them. And so you sometimes find yourself being maneuvered into a position where in order for you to argue against it, you have to deny the obvious truth, and therefore you lose the debate, don't you? Because you don't realize that that's not where the issue rests. Now it is true, definitely it is true, we should all be aware of this, that these problems often are exaggerated, or in some cases they're deliberately created in order to draw us into this undefensible position of having to argue that we have no problem. It's true, but nevertheless, the real solution, the real answer, the real winning side of the debate is based not on the problem, but on the solution. Now, I'd like to give you just an example. This in itself is worthy of an entire presentation. Perhaps you can get somebody here next year to talk about that one. But it's a book called Report from Iron Mountain. Has anybody read that book here? I've got a lot. 1, 2, 3. Okay, very important book. If you've read my book, Creature from Jekyll Island, you'll find a major part of one of the chapters toward the end devoted to a summary or kind of a book report, you might call it, on the report from Iron Mountain. Now, the report from Iron Mountain was actually published in 1967 by Dial Books, and it was a bestseller at the time. And what made it particularly challenging is that it was offered as the leaked document from a study group that was commissioned by the Department of Defense. This was during the Johnson administration under the, let's see, at that time the Secretary of Defense was McNamara. And it was supposedly written by a think tank which was located on, right here in New York, I believe, near Iron Mountain. I'm not sure where Iron Mountain is, but you folks in New York surely do. But there was a Hudson Institute, by exact name, located near Iron Mountain in New York. And the idea was that this was produced by that group, and that the group was met in secret, and their job was to come up with ways and solutions and a program to solve the problem of how to stabilize society in hectic times. Well, doesn't that sound nice? Stabilizing society. That's worthy of our attention. But it doesn't take very long when you start reading the book to realize that they have a very special meaning for the phrase stabilize society.
Stratify.
They're talking about how to protect tyrannical governments from being overthrown by the people who are fed up with them. So their definition of a stable society is a government that cannot be challenged by its people through revolution or any other kind of a political upheaval. That's their concept of stabilizing society. So it pays to actually read these books instead of just what it says on the cover of the book. And once you get the idea that their idea of stabilizing society is how to enslave people, then all of a sudden your interest should be piqued a little bit and you start reading very slowly and carefully. Well, to make a long story short, because the book deserves a very long story, is that the study group analyzed many different ways of doing that. And they decided that the most effective way of stabilizing society was war. Because in times of war, people are frightened so much by the threat of a horrible fate from an enemy that would come in and destroy their cities and plunder their land, that they would undergo any kind of sacrifice. They would take any kind of insult to their liberties in order to exchange that for security from a dreaded enemy. War has always been the best way, said the group, of stabilizing society, because people will follow their leader no matter how bad the leader is. He's better than this image of being conquered by an enemy. And then they said, however, what happens if we succeed in our goal of having a united world where there are no longer any nations, and all the nations are disarmed, which doesn't really mean disarmament, but merely means the transfer of their armaments to a world body. So it's not the elimination of arms or nuclear weapons, that kind of thing. It's the concentration of those nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in the hands of a global government. And then none of the political units could rebel because they would be without the military force to do so. And then people would still have to be controlled. You can't have war because war is now defined out of existence. Anytime you would use an atomic weapon against a group of people or a region, it would then be called peacekeeping operations, for example. So war would be defined out of existence because war, according to these people, is military conflict between nations. If nations don't exist, you can't have war, but you can have peacekeeping operations. And so people that are being killed in acts of war would be killed by peaceful bullets and peaceful bombs. And so they talk about this sort of thing, perhaps not in exactly the same blunt analysis that I just gave it, but that's the drift of it very clearly. And so they said, well, okay, we have to find in anticipation of this nationless world, we have to find something other than war. Now, what could it possibly be that would have that same kind of specter, that same kind of fear, that people would be willing to give up anything and everything to protect themselves from it?
Carbon dioxide.
And they go through the whole list of things, and they talk about even an invasion from outer space, from an alien force. They said, you know, we could make that look pretty realistic. There are ways now we could convince people that we're being invaded by aliens. Now that would unite the world. They would be so afraid of alien technology. They talk about this. They talk about all the possible things. And usually they say, well, they come to the conclusion at the end of each one, they say that it probably won't work as well as war, either because of, in the case of alien invasion, it might be a little difficult to make it convincing enough. They talked about inventing the image of it, but it has to be credible, they said. They didn't say it had to be real. They said reality is not essential in this issue. They said credibility is essential, but not reality. This is incredibly important when we're talking about the dialectic. This is incredibly important when we're talking about the reality of the world in which we live. Anyway, they said some things cannot be credible yet. Maybe we'll figure out some way to make that one credible. And other things are not horrible enough. But they came up with one that they thought had extreme possibility. And that was environmental destruction of the planet. Now they said everybody knows that we have pollution. Everybody knows that. So we start off already with people in partial agreement with us. They said we could also deliberately create environmental catastrophes, which would be so horrible that it would sensitize the world, or at least large portions of the world, to the danger of environmental destruction. That we could create these things. And they said this would warrant such fear on the people of the loss of their environment, the loss of the future for their children and so forth, that they just might be willing to buckle under and take any kind of insult to their liberties and lowering of their economic standards. They would take anything from a tyrannical government in order to protect the future of the planet. They talked about this. Now, you've got to read this book, and by the way, somebody, actually it was Alexa, I believe, or no, anyway, yes, just before my introduction, they mentioned we'd be passing this sheet around for anybody that would like to receive our free unfiltered news. If you put your name on there, I will see that you get an email that shows you where you can acquire this book if you're interested. We have it in our bookstore. Also, if my recording is working, I will be glad to give you a free download of this presentation. If you would like to give us your email, I'll send you a link so you can download this presentation. Okay, having said that, we go back to the main track. Now, even if the threat of environmental disaster is real, or even if it's not as bad as we're told, it is bad, nevertheless. And regardless of that, regardless of whether we agree or disagree on whether or not environmental catastrophe is as real as they say, whether it's exaggerated or whether it's non-existent, the question remains, how do you solve it? Now, there are two approaches to solving problems of this magnitude. There's the one approach which is seldom followed, and that's the freedom of choice approach. That's the approach of individualists who believe that the individual is more important than the group and all of that sort of thing. Most of us here in this room, I think, if we knew the word a little bit better, we would agree that we're all individualists as opposed to collectivists who believe that the group is more important than the individual and everything that flows from that important distinction. Individualists believe that the individual is the foundation of society, and that most of the problems of the world can be solved with focus on the individual and individual action as opposed to group action. And this would be the case, for example, how we solve a problem like this. collectivists believe that people have to be forced. They must be coerced into acting in their own self-interest because they're just too dang dumb to know what's good for them. And so we who are the elitists, we who are in charge, we who are running the government, have the military and the police force, we can force everybody to do what they should do. And therefore, we are doing a very good thing for them, for their own good, by forcing them to follow our rules and regulations. That's the collectivist approach. The individualist says, no, that it's better to do it with voluntary action. For example, I'll just give you a quick example. This is not my topic. I'll move along later. But you can tell a collectivist from an individualist pretty easy on this score. Collectivists believe that seatbelts are important. You know, seatbelts prevent damage, human damage. People get into accidents. They can be killed or injured if they don't wear their seatbelts. And therefore, let's pass a law and make it illegal not to wear seatbelts. And anybody that doesn't do what they're supposed to do, we got a fine for them. And if they repeatedly do it, we're going to put them to prison, if necessary, for life. You know, because that's our obligation to society, is to take care of all these dumb people and force them to do what is right. That's the collectivist mentality. The individualist says, well, seatbelts are a good idea, I agree. Yeah, I wear my seatbelt. People should wear seatbelts. People get hurt by not wearing seatbelts. But we think that the best way to solve this problem is to educate people, to show by our own good example that we follow the rules and so forth. But we don't believe in sending people to prison because they're not doing what we think they ought to do. That's sort of what I'm talking about. Now, does this apply to big issues like environmental disaster and so forth? Yes, it definitely involves that sort of thing. Why do restaurateurs and gas station operators keep clean restrooms? Is it because there's a law that forces them to do it and they're going to go to prison if they don't? Well, I've been in a few where that probably would be the case, but most of them are very clean because it's in their own enlightened self-interest to do so. They're following the profit motive. They don't give a dang about your convenience, but they know that if they don't do this, you won't come back. So the greedy little capitalists that they are, they follow the profit motive and they do what they should do. The same thing applies on the bigger scale to most of these problems. It is in the enlightened self-interest of these big bad corporations and some pretty small bad corporations too, to do what the public wants them to do, because if they don't, they will go out of business. Now that is the individualistic approach to these problems. Nobody ever talks about that at the government level. Why? Because they're in the government. Now government's business is coercion. They're the ones who are paid to pass the rules and the laws and to put you into prison. This is their mindset. Don't expect anything to come out of that group except government laws, coercion, rules, regulations, and fines and penalties. That's what comes from that group because that's their job, that's their mindset. And so this is basically the problem. Nowhere in any of this discussion, at least in the Wikipedia version, will you find any recognition to the role played by the power of enlightened self-interest in the solution of these major problems. As I said earlier, I wish we had time to explore these concepts, that one in particular, when you ripple it out and you bring it down to the smallest and the largest activities of human behavior, you will find that the profit motive, if you will, the enlightened self-interest concept is much more effective than the concept of using coercion. I mean, coercion is the last resort, and anybody that thinks that government is the best answer for solving these problems and controlling these big corporations, take a look next time at what goes on in Washington or your state capital, and then ask yourself the question, who has more influence over your elected representatives? The people or the big corporations? And you all in this room know the answer to that. So when you depend on government and you think that's the answer because they are, quote, elected by the people, and, quote, you have set yourself up for a situation in which these corporations or any wealthy group or individual is able to bribe the gatekeepers and twist things around for their benefit, and the individual loses. Well, that's my comment, at least the brief part of it, on this resources and pollution. But let's move on to population. Population is a real problem, isn't it? And here again, we have the very factor that I have been talking about, which is, well, it's not quite the same, because there is a strong argument against the dread of overpopulation. You don't hear it very much. But everyone takes for granted that the population is on a doomsday course, and that if we don't do something to stop these people from reproducing, you know, the argument, why, there goes the microphone again. Somebody told me to look out for that microphone. They believe that if we don't stop these people from reproducing, why, in a few years, the planet will be covered with human flesh, and it'll be mounting toward the moon at a speed faster than light, you know? And, okay, that, you get the idea. I'm exaggerating, of course, but sometimes the stuff you read is almost in that category. What they don't acknowledge is the ability of the human to adapt to challenges of this kind. I think it was Lloyd George, if I remember correctly, summed it up pretty well. He said, more crows, less corn. More humans, more corn. And there it is, you see. The assumption is that we have limited food resources, and if the population continues to grow, first thing you know, there'll be too many crows and not enough corn. They forget that humans have this amazing capacity to expand the food supply. And it has already expanded. Just take a look at the statistics over the last 100 or so years, and you'll see the productivity of each human farmer has just expanded tremendously, and I think we've only begun to scratch the surface on that. Anyway, that's not the real answer to the argument, because even if you say, well, all right, what happens though in 1,000 years? Aren't we still going to have the same problem? And so theoretically, you have to back off and say, yeah, I suppose in 1,000 years it might be true. Then what do? And I come back to this earlier argument that the solution, whatever it is, if it's to be found, will not be found through government coercion. It will be found through freedom of choice. So if you believe that, then you're on firm ground. If you really doubt that, then I'm afraid you don't really have an argument. You're going to lose the debate, because you'll be looking for some mechanistic type of answer, some formula, and anytime you have a formula, you have to have somebody to enforce the formula, and if you have someone to enforce the formula, you have to have some penalties for those who do not follow the formula, and then you're right back to government again, and you're back to tyranny. Now, at this point, it's time to leave the surface of this topic and delve a little deeper. We go to the subterranean level, and usually when you do that, you get down to the meat of what's really going on. You know, often there are hidden agendas when you get into topics like this, especially when you're dealing with politicians and political issues. If you've observed, quite often if you hang around long enough and dig deeply enough, you find out that, hey, wait a minute, all these words and phrases and arguments, it's just a bunch of cover. Because what's really going on, they're not talking about. It's a hidden agenda of some kind. And that is certainly true here. Agenda 21 is in that category. And it has nothing to do with environmentalism. It has everything to do with ideology, believe it or not, with ideology. When you talk about ideology beneath this topic, we're talking about property rights. Property rights. Are they a human right, or are they property rights? Which is, you have to choose between property rights and human rights, as they sometimes say. They say,
human rights are more important than property rights. What they don't realize is that human rights and property rights are the same thing. Property rights are human rights. Yeah. And they'd like to get you confused on that issue. Well, there are two facts that we need to be clear on when we approach this topic. And that is, and these facts are seldom mentioned in these discussions. One is that all collectivist ideologies, all of them, whether they be communism, Nazism, fascism, socialism, or any of these other isms, they all, without exception, advocate the abolition of private property. And there's a good reason for that, because these people know that if you have private property, you have a means of being independent of the state. They cannot tolerate that. You must be dependent on the state. And the surest way of doing that is to take away your private property. Now, if you don't have private property, you have to depend on somebody else. And it's always the state in these scenarios. You have to depend on the state for your food, your shelter, your clothing, your employment, your insurance, your education, your mortgage on your home, whatever it is, you're dependent upon the state. And if you are dependent upon the state, you must serve the state. And it's a very simple equation, and I think any child in grade school can understand it. All of the collectivist ideologies include that plank, the abolition of private property. That's fact number one. And fact number two is that the implementation of Agenda 21 will totally and forever eliminate private property. That is the net effect of all of these rules and regulations supposedly to allow, protection of the environment. All of this is related to the taking of private property. Or not, they may not take it from you, but they'll take away your right to do what you want to with your private property. You won't be able to build on it. You won't be able to put a road on it. You won't be able to improve it. You won't be able to drain it. You won't be able to dig a well on it. You won't be able to do anything with it except pay taxes on it, in which case they have taken it from you. You do not have private property if you have no right to do what you want to on your private property. And so that's the trick. They're not going to absolutely confiscate it from you, but they will deny you the essence of ownership of it. And so every one of the proposals that you find under Agenda 21 has that net effect, which is denying you the right to private property. And that is not a coincidence, because all of the UN leaders, their agents, and their promoters embrace the ideology of collectivism. Every one of them. It's for this reason that we have just recently added a new platform, or a new paragraph, I guess you should say, to the Freedom Force Code, the Code of Freedom. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but hopefully you will go to our website and look up Freedom Force International, which is an organization which I created a few years ago. And we have a creed of freedom because we believe it's not enough just to know what you're against. It's not just to say, I'm fed up with this, and I'm not going to take it anymore. What do you intend to do that's better is the real question, because throughout history, people have risen up against tyranny, and at great cost and treasure and blood, they've overthrown one tyrant and replaced him with another one exactly the same, or maybe even worse. Because they never asked questions about, what does the new man believe? They came to the conclusion that, well, anything would be better than the guy we got. Does it sound like American politics? Yeah. They don't know who they're not voting for anybody, they're voting against somebody. And that's the condition that brings about one tyranny after another. Because nobody knows what they want, they only know what they don't want. And so we feel that in Freedom Force International that it's important to know what you want. So if you ever had, wouldn't it be wonderful if you had an opportunity to rebuild or to restructure, you better have a plan ready to go. And so we have some platforms in the Creed of Freedom And we just added a new one having to do with private property, and I'd like to read it to you because it sums up this issue with Agenda 21. I believe that the human instinct for private property is a positive force because it is an incentive for production, which is necessary for the material support of mankind. It justly rewards those who use limited resources wisely and punishes those who abuse them. Those without private property must depend on others for survival, and those who depend on the state must serve the state. Therefore, private property is a human right essential for prosperity, justice, and freedom. So that's the plank, and that is a summary of why private property is under attack by Agenda 21. Now, I've just been told that I have 5 more minutes. Thank you. I've just been told that I have 5 more minutes, so I've got to cut all through a major portion of this, which is to everyone's advantage, including mine. And the part I was going to cut through was the other issues leading to the other platforms in the Creed of Honor, but I will just mention them by title. In the Creed of Honor, the Creed of Freedom, excuse me, the Creed of Freedom, we have a statement regarding the origin of rights. Do they come with you, or are they added to you by the state? Are they intrinsic? Are they God-given? Are they hardwired? Are they hardware, or are they software? It's a very important issue. You find collectivists on one side, individualists on the other side. The next issue is group supremacy, which is the superior foundation, or the logical foundation of society? Is it the individual, or is it the group? Should the individual serve the group, which means the state in most of these discussions, or does the state serve the individual? Very important issue. 3, coercion versus freedom. I've been talking about that to some extent as a solution to most problems. We believe, that freedom of choice is always the best answer for these major problems as opposed to coercion. Number 4 is equality versus inequality. Should the laws treat everybody equally or unequally? Most people would say equally, of course. And yet they vote for elected representatives who every single law they write, every one of them, has a provision in it to treat various groups and classes unequally. It's to distribute wealth from the poor to the rich, or to give special benefit to somebody who has, let's say, an ethnic background, or whatever. You look at 95% of our laws on the books today, and they're all written against the principle of equality. They're written because of their inequality. It's because the social engineers wish to change society. They said the way things are, they're not good enough. We need to give these people a special advantage over here at the expense of those people over there. Why? Well, there are more votes over here, that's why. And so we'll think some good reason to make it sound like we're doing it for altruistic reasons, but it's really a question of where the votes come from. Anyway, when you get into all that issue, it's amazing the mess we've gotten ourselves into, because most of our laws are written deliberately to be unequal in their application. And then finally, the role of private property has just been added to that list. And the last one is the proper role of the state, which I must say right here, I was very tempted last night during the debates to jump up and say, I want to say something about this business of governments and states and anarchy and all of these questions. And don't worry, I'm not going to get into it tonight either, but I will say this much. I think that we would clear up a lot of the disagreement if we just dropped the word government, because it has so much different meaning to different people. If we just use the word state, we're still not out of the woods yet, but we eliminated a lot of problems. See, I think that the Founding Fathers made very few mistakes. I think on this issue of, did the Constitution fail? That was an issue last night, remember? Well, the Constitution might have failed, but it was a first draft, folks. It was a beta model. It was the first one that had ever been tried. As a beta model, it was pretty darn good. Now we have a chance to do the next model. Don't give it up. Say, this was a great start. Now we learned a lesson. Let's go on to number 2. Do we want government? Well, what is the purpose of government? Is to govern. Does anybody here want to be governed? No, then you don't want government. And when we use the word government, we say we got to have limited government. Oh, we're in a terrible mess right there. Because the purpose of government is to govern. Is to take away your freedom. You don't want any limited power to take away your freedom. You know, that issue was brought up very well last night. So anyway, we deal with that. The proper role of the state, we believe, is negative, not positive. It's to protect, not to provide. And the whole purpose is to protect your life, liberty, and property, nothing more. It's when you step over that line and ask the state, which has the legalized use of force, and you ask the state to use that force to do something else, then you've lost the war. Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. What do we conclude from all this? Here's my concluding paragraph. This is the Griffipedia version of Agenda 21. Agenda 21 is described by its promoters as a heroic plan for sustainable development and preservation of the environment. But, in reality, it is a blueprint for building world government based on the model of collectivism. The only development it is designed to sustain is the development of more government and more taxes. It is the enemy of true environmentalism and personal freedom. It is the ultimate Trojan horse. So there you have it. Those are my thoughts on Agenda 21. Thank you for listening.